Hello, everyone. Happy Friday, and it's lovely to see you. Blimey, loads of you already in the chat, so that's fantastic. Welcome to another roundup of the events that happened in British history this week. And what have I got for you? Well, got a few royal births. Couldn't be British history without a few of those, could it? Air raids, a couple of those as well. We've got some uprisings. We've got a varsity boat race, forgotten female warrior of English history. A first in the 20th century, the other Dunkirk, and a few battles as ever. So hopefully that's going to keep everyone entertained. A little bit of interest, a little bit of education, and this is sort of one of those my weekly sort of live chat, and a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more off script than my normal main videos. Of course, the latest main video was the Fashoda incident, which I released last night when Britain and France nearly went to war in 1898, all over a tiny fort in a swamp in Sudan. So if you haven't seen that, maybe you want to look at that. Well, maybe you want to go now, and if you want to give up on the live chat, but certainly after the live chat as well. So before I plow into everything, I'll just say hello to everyone who's putting messages in the chat. Where are we at? Blimey, if I just race up to the top, Darren, hello to you. You're the first on today. Jen Ingle, lovely to see you. I would have thought, Jen, you've had enough of me by now. You were on the quiz last night as well. Mike the Disabled Welshman, great to see you. QA Library, fantastic, Dave, to see you as well. And it's great to see you last night on the quiz. So Charlie Manson, lovely to see you up there in Yorkshire. By the way, folks, tell me where you're from in the world. I always like to know where folk are watching the live show from. So whizzing down, we've got Charlie and Charlie. We've got Beverly. Nice to see you as well. Again, a regular. So lovely to have you on board again. And Les, good to see you. And thanks for all your support as a member on my history channel. That's lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Where have we got? Sarah Jane. Loved the video. Oh, thank you very much indeed. I'm presuming you're talking about the Fashoda incident. But I'll tell you what, the last week's one about Pegasus Bridge has been going great guns. So, that seems to have really got people fired up, which is lovely, actually. Loads of comments, loads of interesting comments as well. Sandy, nice to see you. June showers bringing on July flowers. Yeah, we've got a real mixed bag of weather here in Worcester. Who else we've got? Bruce Macaulay it's 10 p.m. in Sydney. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining me then, Bruce. And I am wondering whether I should do one of these shows slightly earlier in the day, as in the UK day. So maybe doing something like 11 a.m. UK time, which Bruce would be about 8 p.m. over in Australia. And I know I've got followers in New Zealand, Australia, Hong Kong, Philippines. So maybe that would actually be quite good for those guys. But I do appreciate my North American fans. You will probably be tearing your hair out thinking you're going to get up 2 hours earlier. So I think I'm just wondering whether I just mix up some of these timescales. Don't know what you think. Anyway, where are we at? Bob, lovely. Thailand. So the Far East, 7 p.m. there. That's cool. And Dalton over in Toronto, lovely to see you. Sorry if I've missed anybody. We've got Pontypool in Wales, obviously. David Webb, hello. And you're really getting into the SOE. Okay, that's cool. SOE is a really interesting subject, massive subject in its own right, and there are some really good stories there, one of which I'm going to talk about later on today. Okay, so and more and more folks. So we've got Canberra, 10 p.m. Timothy Hopper over in Canberra, Australia. So anyway, Royal Britannia, hello from Merseyside. That's a bit more local, isn't it? I'm sure the weather in Merseyside, as ever, is probably cloudy and windy. That's Liverpool normally. So we've got Cincinnati. Ronald, lovely to see you, mate. So anyway, let's crack on then with some events that happened in British history this week. And as usual, I will start on Sunday and work forward. Okay, so the years jump around, but we're working through the week, Monday to Saturday. Okay, so first off, the 9th of June, 1817, the Pentridge Rising. Pentridge is a village in Derbyshire, And this was at a period where, you remember 1817, if you know your British history and sort of working class agitation, 1819 was Peterloo. So this was a period in British history just after the defeat of Napoleon, where the British economy was tanking. It wasn't a post-war boom, it was a post-war depression, because actually quite a lot of the economy had been geared up to fighting the French. And when the war finished, we had a lot of industries didn't suddenly have government orders anymore. We had a whole lot of demobbed soldiers, some demobbed sailors as well. And alongside that, we had the growing industrial revolution and also agricultural revolution as well, which were changing the fundamentals of how people worked, people's livelihoods. Mass production was coming in. So suddenly the fact that you had a little loom in your house was no longer, you weren't really a profitable textile worker, because there was a mill down the road churning stuff out 10 to a penny. And so Britain was in a massive state of flux. The ideas of the French Revolution, very live. French Revolution still only, where are we? 30 years old. And a lot of working class Brits saw both the French Revolution and the American Revolution as the way forward for the working class. And the Pentridge Rising was in that ilk. As I say, 1817 in Derbyshire. It was actually led by a man called Jeremiah Brandreth. And I'd always like to know if he's related to Giles Brandreth, a Conservative member of Parliament, because I just think that's absolutely hilarious if he is. But Jeremiah Brandreth, he was known by his nickname of Captain Nottingham. And he was the ringleader of this uprising. Uprising in inverted commas, they really didn't have an agenda. We're not talking the Bolsheviks here. We're talking about angry working men basically going on a rampage. And half of them not quite sure why they were going on a rampage, but just, things needed changing. And so the only agenda that Jeremiah Brandreth had was wiping out the national debt. Nothing else, no abolishing the House of Lords, killing the king, just wiping out the national debt. You can tell that really gets the people on the barricades, doesn't it? And he gathered some people in the small villages in Derbyshire, centred on Pentridge. And on the 9th of June, 1817, he led a mob advancing on Nottingham. They they killed a servant. They actually went around. They were armed with scythes and cudgels, few muskets. They'd obtained a few muskets, but we really are talking a mob. And not a very well-armed or organised mob. They went through. They actually went to a factory near Ripley and tried to storm it because they believed there would be some weapons there. And basically, the factory foreman had a standoff with them, and some of his mob actually went over and sided with the factory foreman, and others just drifted away because they thought, if this is what an uprising is, it's not worth the trouble. And basically they had to back off. The foreman wasn't going to let them into the factory. So if you know that part of the East Midlands, they marched on Ripley, then they went to Codnor, then Langley Mill, sort of small towns up in the Amber Valley area of Derbyshire. And at each town they went to, they were either forcing the pubs to open or indeed just basically going into the pubs. So in true British fashion, by the time they got to Nottingham the following morning on the 10th of June, loads of them were drunk, and quite a few were sleeping it off en route. It was sort of like Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, but just drunken blokes lying in the lanes, no longer part of the uprising. And they got to Nottingham, and there they were faced by the Light Dragoons, 15th Regiment of Light Dragoons at Giltbrook, in the very north of, up at the very top end of Nottingham towards Mansfield, but in Nottingham. And basically, at the sight of the Dragoons, everyone lost heart. The leaders were the first to flee. They cleared off. Something like 85 people were arrested for taking part in the uprising. 3 were transported. And Jeremiah Brandreth and 2 of the others were actually hanged for high treason. In fact, actually, the punishment still in those days was hang, drawing, and quartering. But the later George IV, Prince Regent at the time, who was ruling on behalf of his dad, George III, who was going through another one of his little madness bits. George Prince Regent basically commuted the sentence to just hanging and none of the drawing and quartering stuff. And that was the end of Jeremiah Brandreth and the Pentridge Rising. Not a lot of people know about that story. And what was really weird is, about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, I was doing a house up in Chester, of all places. And I was doing up a house, Victorian property. And the workman that I was chatting to came from Derbyshire. And we got talking about the Pentridge Rebellion. And would you believe one of his relatives was one of the ringleaders who actually got transported to Australia? So talk about a small world, hey? But there you go. A nice little bit from British sort of, what do you call it, working class history, industrial history, political history, and one that not many people know. Probably not many people in the East Midlands know, for that matter. So anyway, quick look over at the comments just to see what's going on, because that's part of the fun of these live talks is, if we were all in a pub or something, we'd all be throwing our two penneth in, wouldn't we? So let's just see how we're doing. Curie Library, thank you very much indeed for your generous £5 there. Thank you very much indeed. That's nice. So, why do different sources have different dates to end the Falklands War? Ends this week today. Does that happen to different wars and battles? Dave, yeah, probably it does. Sometimes it's taken as the last battle. Sometimes it's taken by the peace treaty. So I think very often, and other times it's by a surrender. So there are different points in wars that you can find or choose to say it finished. That's all I can say on that one, really. I mean, generally, I've seen all of them actually. Like, for instance, the Zulu War. When did it end? Battle of Ulundi, final battle, capture of King Keshwayo. I mean, there was never any formal surrender by the Zulus. So when did the Zulu War finish? Whereas something like the Boer War, the Second Anglo-Boer War, there was the Treaty of Veringen, and you can officially say that because of the peace treaty, that was the end of the war. But that's my thoughts for what it's worth. But other people might have a different opinion, and I'd love to hear what your opinions are, actually, folks. Darren, typical British pub crawl, absolutely. From the Pentridge Rebellion. If you change time, you'll be streaming when I'm in school. Oh, is that so? That's bad news, is it? I have to be honest. This sort of time works for a fair few of my Americans. Probably the guys on the Pacific time, it probably doesn't do. Also works, of course, for a lot of my Brits. And as much as I try to be fair to everyone and try to involve everyone, the Brits and the Americans make up about closing in on 3/4 of my audience. So the Aussies come in third. About 10% of my viewers are Australian. So there you go. So probably going to stick around this 1 p.m. time for most. Some people have asked me to go later in UK time, like 4 o'clock. But you see, there's never a perfect time, is there? Right, let me come on with a second. We'll come back to the comments, but let me come on to my next thing. 10th of June, 1667. We're going back a bit now. 1667, 10th of June, the Dutch Navy raid Kent. Well, they didn't just raid Kent. They actually raided up the Medway River, where the Royal Navy was at anchor. So this was sort of a British Pearl Harbor moment back in the 1600s, in the reign of King Charles II. It was during the Second Anglo-Dutch War. The Dutch and the British, and particularly the English, were at loggerheads. They were both Protestant nations. They were sort of leading Protestant nations, really, of Europe at the time. But they were massive trade rivals. And the Anglo-Dutch wars tended to come about because of trade rather than ideological or religious differences. And so we're into the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and the Dutch had the audacity to sail across the North Sea. And on the 10th of June, 1667, they attacked Sheerness on the Isle of Sheppey. Sheerness was basically a fort guarding the River Medway. They stormed it. So that was the end of the defence of the River Medway, really. And then their fleet sailed up the River Medway, firing at any Royal Navy battleship that they could see. And in the next 4 days, the Dutch Navy sank 13 Royal Naval warships and captured another 2, including the flagship of the fleet called the Royal Charles, in honour of King Charles II. and they towed that back to across the North Sea to the Netherlands. So hugely embarrassing, massive defeat, and there's no two ways around it. Not quite in the surprise attack of Pearl Harbor, but fundamentally British fleet lying at anchor and taking absolute pummeling from the Dutch. So yeah, thought I'd share that one with you. Don't know what you think, but we forget these sort of, the British and Dutch fought lots of wars. Let's keep on the 10th of June. I'll do a few more 10th of Junes and come back to the comments. Okay, folks? 10th of June, 1688. So 20 years later, really, 21 years later, the Old Pretender is born, James Francis Stuart. He was the son of James II of England, James VII of Scotland, and his wife, Mary of Modena. Modena was in Italy, I think. And this changed British history, because James II, his father, if we call him by his English title, okay, James II was a Catholic in a Protestant country. And fundamentally, Protestant English and indeed Protestant Scots did not like this. However, they were willing to live with it, because Mary of Modena, he'd been married to Mary for quite some time. It was his second wife. She had basically not produced any kids. And from his first marriage, he had two daughters who were both Protestants. So basically, when James died, in classic British fashion, we'd have just kicked the can down the road a bit. And then eventually, when he died, the throne could go to one of the Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne. And then suddenly, in 1688, 10th of June, 1688, all things changed. Mary of Modena had a son, James Francis Stuart. And in the British line of succession at the time, only ever so recently changed, boys took precedent over girls in the line of succession, no matter who was born first. So suddenly, Mary and Anne, who were, they were in their 20s by now, Mary and Anne were going to be bypassed with this little boy, whose mother was Roman Catholic, whose father was Roman Catholic. No doubt he would be Roman Catholic. And suddenly we would have a Catholic dynasty in Britain, in England and Scotland, on the don't forget, in those days, of two separate thrones, two separate countries. And this caused consternation. And this led directly to what's called the Glorious Revolution, where Mary arrived from the Netherlands with her husband, William of Orange, William and Mary. And basically, in a bloodless revolt, James was forced to flee and abdicate, and he was kicked off the throne. And that was the beginning both of the Protestant ascendancy in Britain, but ultimately, of course, as well in the Jacobite cause, the Jacobite rebellions, because James had been kicked off his throne. He didn't agree that his daughter and son-in-law should kick him off the throne. And of course, this young James Francis Stuart, born on the 10th of June, 1688, he believed it was the rightful king. And indeed, many people in Britain believed that too. Probably the minority, but enough, and especially Catholics, but not solely Catholics. There were others who said, actually, the law of succession is the succession. You can't pick and choose whether you like someone because of their color of their hair or their religion. And that led to a series of revolts, the Jacobite revolts. First on behalf of King James himself, then led by what became the Old Pretender, James Francis Stuart, in 1715. He also had one in 1708, and there was one later on, 1719. And then, of course, when he became an old man, James Francis Stuart, who'd never come on the throne, James Francis Stuart, his young son, Bonnie Prince Charles Edward Stuart, took up the cause, and of course that's the 1745 Jacobite rebellion. So a momentous moment in British history on the 10th of June 1688, when James Francis Stuart was born in the Stuarts, and of course changed Britain forever. So interestingly, James Francis Stuart, called the Old Pretender because Bonnie Prince Charlie was the young pretender. They had pretensions for the throne. He actually died in 1766, so he lived to a ripe old age, 77, always in exile. And funny enough, his father, James II, died in 1701. So had the had the Glorious Revolution never taken place and James II had been allowed to stay on the throne, James Francis would have become king. He would have become King James III of England in 1701, and he would have ruled until 1766, assuming there wasn't a rebellion or anything, which would have made him a longer-serving monarch than Queen Victoria, and only beaten by Queen Elizabeth II. There you are. That's a little snippet for you. But of course, he got nowhere near the throne, so that was the end of that one. But there you go. And funny enough, his first attempt to seize the throne or to raise rebellion in his own right was in 1708. He tried to land in Scotland, take a ship and raise a rebellion in Scotland. Didn't actually get as far as Scotland because the Royal Navy blocked his passage in the North Sea. The Royal Naval Squadron was commanded by Admiral George Byng, and his son, Admiral John Byng, was the admiral who was executed, shot, court-martialed, and then executed by firing squad on the deck of his ship at Portsmouth Harbour in the late 1700s. So little link in there for any of you who know the story of Admiral Byng being court-martialed for the loss of Minorca in the Mediterranean during the 7 Years' War. There you go. Let me just actually, yeah, we'll let me just see what's going on over there. Timothy, that's very kind of you as well. Thank you very much indeed for your generosity. That's really nice. Thank you. Much appreciated. Much appreciated. Alex Sexton has said, hi, Chris, great video on the Fashoda incident from a rainy Sydney. Yeah, looking out the window, it's a rainy Worcester here now as well. So yeah, but Alex, lovely you've joined us from Australia. Geraint Thatcher, not that bloodless. Well, the actual overthrow of James was bloodless. Everything that happened afterwards, Geraint wasn't. And Churchill betrayed James. Yes, we're talking John Churchill here, future Duke of Marlborough. Thank you very much, Geraint, for throwing that one in. QA Library, you've got a very naughty sense of humour. It's not she was Mary of Modena, Modena, not Mary of Madonna. But anyway, Charles Manson's put an interesting one in. This week in 1940 saw the first prisoners, Polish political prisoners, sent to Auschwitz. Bit of a sobering one. Thank you. Hello to Calgary in Alberta. Lovely to see you. Pershaw lad here. So my partner Sarah is a teacher in Pershaw. So there you go. We were in Pershaw not that long ago, a few weeks ago. Sandy, glorious revolution created a lot of blood to be shed. Not that glorious, no. And unarguably, was it a glorious revolution? Only glorious if you're on the winning side and a Protestant. But it's interesting how narratives are made, isn't it? And I talk about this most weeks. It's not just about the truth, whatever the truth is. The truth is anything to anyone, isn't it? But it's how certain things get written into the narrative. There was this glorious revolution preserving Britain's, but what they really were talking about was England's ancient liberties and rights. Only for those of you who had them. Don't forget, most working class people didn't have many liberties and rights really at that time, did they? Certainly didn't have many rights, but many believe they did. And preferred to be English than French and things like that. Anyway, we're going off down a rabbit hole. So let's get back up here. Fred, good to see you. Shrewsbury in Massachusetts. I think you were on my history quiz last night as well. So thank you very much. Tasha, I sold car insurance to a relative of Admiral Byng. Awesome. Blimey. Still think my handyman, whose relative was one of the leaders of the Penkridge Rebellion, beats that, trumps that. But hello. Is history now written by the winners nowadays? Interesting question, QA Library. What do people think? Is history written by the winners? I mean, I'm always slightly skeptical about history. Has history ever been written by winners? And I'll use a classic, okay? And try not to step on too many people's toes. Think about the history of Ireland. Okay, for a large part of the history of Ireland, the British, English, and Protestants were in the ascendancy. But Irish history and Irish nationalist history has a very different telling. So you could argue that was Irish history, for instance, written by the people who had been subjugated or the people who were doing the subjugating? Don't know. I would argue maybe Afrikaners have never lost their sense of history and their view of things like the Anglo-Boer War, despite the fact that militarily, ultimately, they were defeated and effectively surrendered in 1902. So the British were the winners of the Boer War, but I'm not sure that's how history is necessarily remembered in part, certainly in communities, certain communities in South Africa. So interesting, and I'd be interested to know what people think. If you've got a view, is history written by the winners or the losers, or indeed is it changing now from being a history that originally was written by winners and is now being written by losers? Please join in the chat, and I'll try and keep up with you whilst trying to share some more British history with you at the same time. You just got bombed by non-skippable adverts. I'm really sorry about that, mate. YouTube at its best. I guess they have to make money somehow, don't they? So yeah, Geraint, people think England won the 100 Years' War because of Agincourt. Yeah, and you know it's interesting narrative. I mean, I'm fascinated with historical narratives. Don't want to go down there, but maybe there's a live show sometime where we just talk about this, because you know, and another classic in British thing is is Dunkirk, isn't it? You know that militarily a defeat. We managed to get a lot of troops off. Probably if the troops hadn't got off, that would have been Britain brought to the negotiating table with Hitler. But they left most of their heavy armor behind. They left a lot of equipment behind. It was effectively, it was infantry troops arriving back in England with potential panzer invasion. But that is not the way that we remember it as a military defeat. British people remember it as a great salvation. So, interesting narratives, isn't it? All the time in history, everyone, people talk about, you need to tell the real story. But I mean, and I put that out of some of my videos, don't I? The real story. But what's the real story? Partly what you want to believe as a nation, as well as a person. Yeah. Uncle Heavy thinks that the internet is democratizing history. Interesting, Uncle Heavy. I don't know if that means that's a good thing or bad thing, but Jen, I think it's changed. We now know all sides. I think there's more of a keenness to find out different sides from history. I saw a book recently. Was it D-Day, German Perspective? Interesting. Obviously, I've come across a lot of oral history being shared by Zulu historians about the Zulu Wars, which back in 1900, or when Morris was writing Washing of the Spears, he didn't bother with that. Although in fairness, he was in Berlin at the time working for the CIA, so he probably couldn't get down to South Africa to interview lots of Zulu veterans or descendants. But yeah, so it's interesting, and of course, people have different perspectives, massively different perspectives, depending which side you come from and what happened to your family in the process. Right, let me keep going because time is moving on, and we're only at the 10th of June. So let me jump through to where are we at? 11th of June. 11th of June. What have I got here for you? Okay, 1509. Catherine of Aragon married Henry VIII, his first wife, and sometimes we forget, Henry VIII. It's all, but of course, she was actually, by this stage, she was in her 20s. She'd actually been in England since 1501, 1502, where she'd actually married Henry's older brother, Arthur Tudor. Arthur was the heir apparent. He was the Prince of Wales, son of Henry VII. And they married. Brilliant match by Henry VII. He was a canny king, if nothing else. And he was allying the royal house of Tudor, as well as England generally, to the up-and-coming Spanish superpower. And Catherine of Aragon obviously represented that, daughter of the King of Spain. And unfortunately, Arthur died in 1502 in Ludlow Castle. He and Catherine were living together. By all accounts, they hadn't consummated the marriage. But they were living together in Ludlow Castle, and both caught sweating fever, which is a disease we don't have anymore, but it was prevalent, especially in Elizabethan times, early Stuart period, and tended to affect the upper classes more than working classes, and was very often a killer. And so it proved to be with Arthur Tudor, who died, and funny enough, is buried in Worcester Cathedral, where I live. Or I don't live in the cathedral, in the city. Catherine survived and was basically left for the next 7 years stuck in England. Potential marriage to the younger brother, Henry, Duke of York, who was now going to become Henry, Prince of Wales. And eventually, however, during that time, she was actually made Spanish ambassador by her father, Spanish ambassador to London, and holds the unique position, Catherine of Aragon, of being the very first female ambassador in Europe. There you go. And finally, in 1509, she married Henry VIII, as he now was. He'd come to the throne earlier that year, come to the throne in the April of that year. So, we're only May, June, 2 months into his kingship. He decided he needed a wife, needed an heir, and we all know the story from there. But and he marries Catherine of Aragon, and of course, she produced him a daughter, Mary, but she didn't produce any sons that lived. And Henry ultimately became convinced that this is because he was sleeping with his brother's wife, and he believed that, contrary to her views and her protestations, that marriage had been consummated, and basically he was living in sin, and God was punishing him by not giving him a male heir. I think part of that was a sincere belief, but he was actually besotted about having a male heir in particular, and hence we end up with Anne Boleyn, Catherine being divorced, and the break with the Church of Rome. But back in 1509, on the 11th of June, 1509, they actually were married. And actually, interestingly, and we forget this in history because we all go about Henry VIII and his 6 wives, but they were married, him and Catherine of Aragon were married for 24 years, which is longer than Henry was married to the other 5 wives put together. So, and she was a very loyal wife to him. She actually looked after England in his absence, and she strategically masterminded the troops, or the battles, the English army that went up to fight the Scots at the Battle of Flodden, which was where the King of Scotland was killed. So, a very loyal wife in many respects. And she died having been divorced, obviously never recognised by the Roman Catholic Church as a divorce, and she refused to believe she'd been divorced. But she died in 1536 at Kimbolton Castle and is buried at Peterborough Cathedral. So there you go. Let me just have a quick look over here, because it looks like Les Bowring, is saying it depends on which side is telling the story and what is taught at school. Absolutely. That's back to history, whether it's told by the victors or not. Let me see if we get away from that thing, because we could be in there. Timothy, good point, interesting point there. What happened to the French Curie Library? What happened to the French troops left in the UK after Dunkirk? A lot of them were sent back to France for a counterattack. Yes, they were. Churchill was actually keen to get as many of them off the beaches at Dunkirk and back into battle as fast as possible. If you ever read 2 independent witnesses to a car accident, you do wonder whether about history, as 2 people seeing the same incident rarely agree on the details. Yeah. And don't forget that one thing I have had, and I've had people say this to me, Winston Churchill's account of the war on the Nile is a first-hand account, and it should be believed, not argued with. He didn't see everything. He was actually putting accounts in there of second-hand accounts of his own, that people were telling him at the officers' mess and things like that. And you're absolutely right. People remember what they think happened as much as what really did happen. So anyway, let's just see if we can get out of this rabbit hole. I should never have gone down there for you, should I? Sorry, folks. Maybe a story about the English Civil War concerning Bristol. Ever heard of the Battle of the Windmill, Geraint? No, I haven't. But I'm going to do some stuff on the English Civil War at some stage, all right? Timothy, you're disappointed I don't live in the cathedral. Uh, I tell you what, I don't know anywhere else in Britain. Such lousy weather at the minute. It can't be any colder living in a medieval cathedral, can I? I actually stuck the blinking heating on again last night. June. I have never done that in my adult life. Stuck the heating on, but blow me down. It was cold last night. Um, Thank you very much. Okay, we've got someone talking about Langley Mill and the Pentridge Rebellion. Fine. Let's crack on. 12th of June, 918, back in Anglo-Saxon England. Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, died. I'm going to do a story about Ethelflaed at some stage. The only problem I do have, okay, is that whenever I do a story about a woman, or women on my YouTube channel, okay, the videos just don't do anything. It's like, I don't know, is it I don't know what it is, but so my VAD nurses from the First World War, all those amazing women, that didn't do anything. Hannah Snell, the female soldier in Georgian England, that didn't do anything. But I feel like I've got to tell the story of Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians. Anyone who is a fan of Bernard Cornwell and the Last Kingdom series, okay, we know that Uhtred basically has a bit of a soft spot for Alfred's daughter, Ethelred. That's the Ethelred we're talking about. She genuinely was the daughter of Alfred the Great in history, Alfred the Great of Wessex. She was married off to the Lord of Mercia. Mercia was now Mercia had been divided, one of the great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It had been invaded by the Vikings. The Vikings occupied the eastern half of Mercia, in particular what they called the five boroughs: Lincoln, Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, and Stamford. And they'd also taken over areas like Northampton. So that whole area of Mercia had been occupied by the Vikings. Originally, they'd put a puppet king on the what was the rump of Mercia. But with Alfred's victories over Guthrum, he basically that changed, and he found a nobleman from Mercia and said he's the Lord of Mercia. Interestingly, Alfred was not interested in creating a king of Mercia, because Alfred did have this ambition of creating an England or Angleland. But an Angleland, all the Saxons and Angles together, but obviously ruled by the House of Wessex. So the last thing you want to do is go and remind the Mercians that they could have a king and indeed have a rival king in the middle of England. So we had Ethelred, Lord of Mercia. And just to make sure that Alfred had his finger in the pie, he married his daughter, Ethelflaed, to him. Ethelflaed is a remarkable character, really remarkable, and forgotten from British history and forgotten from English history. By 902, she was de facto ruler of Mercia. It seems that her husband, who in the Last Kingdom series, any of you who are Bernard Cornwell fans, watch The Last Kingdom, he's a bit of a sod to his wife. Well, actually, that's fiction. Everything looked like actually they had a pretty good relationship, ruled together, signed charters together. But it looks like around 902, he was incapacitated, probably wounded in battle and fighting the Vikings. And he was, for the next 10 years, Ethelflaed effectively was the regent, ruling on behalf of her ailing husband. During that time, she defended Chester against an invasion from Vikings from Dublin in Ireland. And then in 910, she allied with her brother, Edward the Elder, son of Alfred the Great, obviously, and they defeated, the two of them brought the armies of Wessex and Mercia together and defeated a Viking invasion of Mercia at Tettenhall, near Wolverhampton, modern-day Wolverhampton. In 911, her husband died, and the Witan came together, and her brother Edward was like rubbing his hands in glee, because we knew what the Witan were going to do. They were going to make him king, Lord of Mercia, so we could just become king of Mercia, and Project England was on. And the Witan of Mercia came together, which are the leading nobles, the leading lights of, people have called it a parliament. So, I'd say more like the leading lights and leading magnets rather than the parliament. But nevertheless, they came together and they elected Ethelflaed as their lady, as their leader of Mercia. Edward couldn't believe it, but there's not all he could do, especially as she was his elder sister. And for the next 7 years, she ruled Mercia in her own right as the Lady of Mercia. Interestingly, I'll come back to the title in a moment. She then took the war. Her and her brother basically worked in tandem, attacking the Vikings in England, the Danish and North settlements in England. In 917, she actually defeated the Vikings and captured one of the 5 boroughs at Derby. Led an army that defeated the Vikings at Derby. The following year, Leicester actually surrendered to her without a fight. So she'd taken two of the great 5 boroughs, and then amazingly, her brother was starting to roll up from the south through the East Midlands, through Northampton. He captured Nottingham. So Vikings being rolled back, and in 918, the great Viking kingdom of Jorvik submitted to Ethelflaed. They said, we will actually submit to you. But before the submission could actually be honoured, Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, died. So interestingly, Edward was now rubbing his hands again because his sister's out the way. We all know who's going to be the king. And the Witan once more turned their back on Wessex and elected her daughter as Lady of the Mercians. And a couple of interesting things there. Number one, she was called Lady of the Mercians. Interestingly, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by monks on behalf of the House of Wessex, Ethelflaed is not called the Lady of the Mercians. She was called the Sister of the King. Hey, so wait, everyone, we were talking about how's history recorded. There's a classic, isn't it? There was the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. She was just the Sister of the King. The Irish Annals and the Annals of Ulster, written at this time, called her the Great Saxon Queen. And the Annals and the Chronicles in Mercia called her the Lady of Mercia. So take your pick. But Ethelflaed, I think she's worth a story. What do people think? Should I do a video about Ethelflaed and chance it and see if people actually might like a story about a forgotten warrior queen of England, of Britain? What do you reckon? Any comments? Please do. And I'm just looking what everyone else is saying. We had Langley Mill, got that one there. Palomar Stream. Wow, that was interesting. Thank you, Kerry Library. I'm assuming you're talking about Ethelflaed and not something else that's going on in the conversations. Mike, disabled Welshman, go for it, Chris. Yeah, and if you're a Welshman, Mike, you'll be pleased to know that her husband had a bit of reputation of fighting the Welsh, or at least the kings of Gwynedd in the north, and came off second best to them as well. So there you go. And I actually personally find that whole period of the Anglo-Saxons and the Welsh kingdoms fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But there you go. Easy Gamer, you'd watch it. Good man, thank you. Maybe I'll do one. It won't be a massively long one because we don't have a lot of information about Ethelflaed, not compared to Pegasus Bridge or the Fashoda incident. And it doesn't help when the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle just put in a line like, and there was the king's sister. Thank you for that helpful bit, Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. But there you go. Go for the Ethelflaed video. Brilliant. Charlie Manson, best pleased to inform Her Majesty the Union Jack once more flies over Stanley, God save the Queen. Major General Moore, 14th of June, 1982. You're stealing my thunder, mate. You're stealing my thunder. We're coming to that in a moment. All right. So let's flick on very quickly. Where are we? 15 minutes to go. Okay. In 13th of June. 13th of June. Well, we'll come to your point there, actually, Charlie, that you've mentioned it. Okay, 13th of June, 1982. The Battle of Mount Tumbledown the Battle of Mount Tumbledown on the Falkland Islands begins. Obviously, a battle between the British and the Argentinians. It was the British 5th Infantry Brigade, which included the Scots Guards, the Welsh Guards, Gurkhas, and also 3 Commando Brigade as well. And that was against the equal sort of numbers, about 650, 700 on each side. But ends up in a significant. The British captured Mount Tumbledown in the early hours of the 14th of June, and basically that was the last decent defendable position the Argentinians had on the island. They still controlled Port Stanley, the capital, below Mount Tumbledown, and the writing was on the wall. And later on in the morning of the 14th of June, 1982, the Argentinians surrendered to the British on the Falkland Islands, bringing to a close the end of the Falklands War. And interestingly, we talked about when does the war finish earlier. Again, I think most people would say it's the 14th of June, but there was never a treaty signed or anything like that. But it was a surrender. So I think surrenders are quite are a moment where a lot of people see wars finishing. Let's stay on the 13th, but just go back a little bit in history because I wanted to share a couple of things with you. 13th of June 1917, the deadliest air raid on London during the First World War. On the 13th of June, 20 Gotha bombers, German Gotha bombers, attacked London, dropped bombs on London. 160 people were killed, 430 were wounded. And I mean, that was a massive sort of terror attack. London had never seen anything like that. They'd had Zeppelins dropping odd bombs in the past. They'd had Gotha bombers coming over and dropping bombs, but they'd never had a mass air raid. Admittedly, 20 aircraft is not like some of the stuff that happened in the London Blitz in the Second World War, but it had never been seen before. So, a real shock to the people of London. What was really shocking was that a school in Poplar was also bombed. A bomb fell on a school in Poplar and 18 children were killed. And again, this really sort of brought it home to the British people that warfare was changing from glorious battles in foreign fields somewhere or on the high seas to something that was happening to civilians in Britain. And obviously set the scene really for how war has developed since then, both in the Second World War and beyond. But interestingly, in the Second World War, exactly the same day, 13th of June, 1944, the first V1 bomb missile landed on London. Landed in Grove Road near Mile End Station, killed 6 people, and it fell on some houses, and basically 6 people killed, something like 30 wounded, 200 made homeless. So, and there's a monument actually on by the railway bridge by Mile End Station there, commemorating this. So if you go there, there's a blue plaque on the wall. So there you go. Let's have a very, very quick one here. Yes, to the Mercians. Yeah. Tumbledown. Sadly, he never really came home, says Uncle Heavy. I think I follow you. Yeah. Yeah. Sad. Robert Lawrence won the MC on Tumbledown, losing 42% of his brain, but later recovered. Bye. People have asked me if I would do a talk on the Falklands, and I'm steering away from it. And the only reason I'm steering away principally is I think there are a lot of people who were there who can tell the story, well, maybe a different style of story, but I think they would tell a story with a huge amount of authority and deserve to be heard. And I think I've got plenty of other places I can tell stories about. So for those of you who think maybe you think I'm wrong, but that's why I steer clear of that one. And interestingly, the Battle of Mirbat in Oman as well. That's another one where I just think there are other people that could probably tell the story, although that's further back in the 1960s. So 60s? No, sorry, early 70s. Late 60s, 70s. Anyway, right. Let's finish off this week in British history. Let's come to today, 14th of June. Obviously, you had the Argentinians surrendering in the Falklands in 1982, but we also have 3 battles. Okay, we're going to really rack through them fast for you. 1264, the Battle of Lewes in Sussex. This was a rebellion by the barons. We all talk about, we all remember King John and the Magna Carta. There was a growing, through the Middle Ages, there was a growing tension between the powers of the monarchy and the powers of the barons. Some people would sort of see it as the beginnings of democracy in Britain. Yeah, beginnings maybe, but we're talking about barons wanting more power at the expense of the king. There wasn't barons wanting power to give it to the peasants. Okay, let's just get that absolutely right. But there was this growing, and Parliament did become part of this thing. It was curtailing the powers of a monarch, and ultimately Parliament would then start to take powers away from the barons as well, or power from the barons, and give it to more and more people. the road to democracy was a very long and torturous one in English history and British history. But 1264, the barons, a baron's army under Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, met an army that was twice the size, actually. I think it was something like 10,000 versus 5,000, met the army of King Henry III of England and his son, Edward, Prince of Wales. And at the end of the battle, actually, it was a disaster for the Royalists. Royalists lost nearly a quarter of their men. So nearly 3,000 were killed or wounded in the battle. Very few were lost on de Montfort's side. And basically, King Henry III became effectively a prisoner of de Montfort, as indeed did his son, Edward, Prince of Wales. And for the next few years, de Montfort was de facto ruler of England, even though obviously never proclaimed himself king, didn't want to be king, or certainly never. It's never been written that he wanted to be king, as far as I'm aware. But he did call a parliament, and it was the first time a parliament had been called by de Montfort. First time a parliament had been called where it wasn't just the barons there. He actually brought in members of the big towns, people from the big towns, and people from the shires, and that never stopped after that. These representatives from the towns and the shires came to Parliament along with the bishops and the barons and the nobility. And over time, and certainly by the time we get to the Tudor period, and most certainly by Edward VI's reign after Henry VIII, these bodies started to break up and meet in two different chambers, a House of Lords and a House of Commons. But really, that was the very beginning of the Commons being invited to Parliament under de Montfort. And it all started because of his victory at the Battle of Lewes on the 14th of June, 1264. Another important battle, and another one that didn't go well for a monarch, same day, 14th of June, 1645, the Battle of Naseby during the English Civil War. This was a battle that was an emphatic parliamentary win. It really, in many respects, was the last roll of the dice by King Charles I. And I've done a short talk about that, actually, in my members channel. I did a live, well, it wasn't a live, it was a recording from Naseby. Great battlefield in Northamptonshire. Anyone that wants to go and see it. You can almost, if you go on site like British Battlefields, or indeed the Battlefield Trust site, you can really see how the battle panned out. And when you stand on the battlefield, it's one of those battlefields where you can basically see, to this day, where the battle was fought. Okay, fields and stuff, it's not all mowed grass and things, but it hasn't been, there isn't a factory sitting there or anything like that, okay, or a motorway through it or something. But Naseby, basically, major battle, massive parliamentary victory, not least because of Oliver Cromwell, and it was under General Fairfax was leading the parliamentary forces. His second in command was Oliver Cromwell with the cavalry, but it was Cromwell's cavalry, the Ironsides, that rode in to the infantry, the Royalist infantry, as it advanced, and basically captured it. And the Royalists lost they lost about 1,000 of their troops there, but something like 4,500 were captured. And King Charles was never able to put another army of that size into the war. And a year later, he'd surrendered, and all roads were ultimately to lead to his beheading, trial and execution. But Naseby was really the last significant battle that maybe could have turned it for Charles. After that, he didn't have the forces left because he'd lost them all at Naseby. And finally, on the 14th of June, 1658, the Battle of the Dunes. And you're thinking, okay, I've heard of Lewes, I've heard of Naseby. What the hell is the Battle of the Dunes? This is the other Dunkirk. Would you believe? This is in the time just after Naseby, actually, during the Commonwealth, Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth, so the parliamentary rule of England. And it was one of these real European treaties and wars are all, they move around all the time. So what we actually had was the Spanish, major Catholic power, and the French, major Catholic power on the mainland, at war with each other. The Spanish actually controlled modern-day Belgium. That was called the Spanish Netherlands. And in these sort of almost like an unholy alliance, Cromwell, great Protestant hope, allied with Catholic France to take on Catholic Spain. and sent an army over to modern-day Belgium, where they fought alongside a French army versus a Spanish army supported by lots of English and Scottish royalists who were exiled. So we had this strange army. It was and there was a significant force in the Spanish army, about 2,000 royalists, commanded by the Duke of York, as he was at the time, later to become James II, who we talked about earlier, with his son, James Francis, being kicked off, and James being kicked off the throne. But at this stage, he was the Duke of York, or called the Duke of York, and he led a force with the Spanish of 2,000 royal exiles. It was an emphatic victory for the French and the English Commonwealth Army, or the British Commonwealth Army, as it was. And the British Commonwealth troops, we're talking Commonwealth in the 1600s, not Commonwealth today, ex-empire. But the English force, or British force, was led by a man called William Lockhart. He was a Scottish Covenanter. He'd then obviously been recruited by Cromwell, and Lockhart he'd married Cromwell's niece, actually, so he was in the family, and he was over there at the Battle of the Dunes. And what was really interesting was that something like 10 days later, it was fought outside Dunkirk in the Dunes. And interestingly, the word Dunkirk came from the church in the Dunes, Dunkirk. Okay, so that's where Dunkirk comes from in Flemish. Anyway, battle outside was a victory for the French and the Commonwealth troops, Cromwell, or Lockhart on behalf of Cromwell. And then 10 days later, Dunkirk surrendered as a town, and the French gave it to Oliver Cromwell. So we always remember, and it stayed for the next 5 years. It was under English control or British control. So we always remember the last foothold in Northern Europe being Calais, which had been lost in Mary Tudor's time. But actually, for 5 years, the British controlled, or the English in particular, controlled Dunkirk. And funny enough, it's still under English control when Charles II came to the throne, was restored, and he sold it to the French in 1662 for something like £300,000, which is a fair bit of money. And actually, that helped Charles rule without needing a parliament all the time, because he had a fair bit of cash. Thank you very much from that treaty. So the Battle of the Dunes, just one of those really forgotten stories. I think it's quite a cool one, really, just that we'd been at Dunkirk, 300 years, just so 280 years before the troops were wading out into the water. Operation Dynamo, which of course ended last week in British history. And there we are, top of the hour. I won't tell you the other things that happened on tomorrow, 15th. I will just mention them. 15th of June, 12:15, Magna Carta, signed by King John at Runnymede. And of course, in 1957, the American Bar Association erected a really impressive monument at Runnymede. And it's somewhat ironic that the big memorial that celebrates the Magna Carta being signed at Runnymede was paid for and erected by Americans. And the English seem to just sort of go, yeah, it's the Magna Carta, isn't it? 4 clauses from the Magna Carta still in English law to this day, but won't go into that now. But fundamentally about you can't be imprisoned without trial, and you there's justice for everyone. Everyone has access to justice with no favour or money. And also on the 15th of June 1919, John Alcock and Arthur Brown become the first men to fly across the Atlantic non-stop in an old World War I bomber. And they flew from Newfoundland in Canada to Galway in Ireland. And it took them 72 hours. Whereas a flight from London Heathrow to JFK now takes about 8 hours, but 72 hours coming across the Atlantic. Unbelievable. They were awarded a prize by the Daily Mail. It was a competition, the first person to come across the Atlantic, and they won the Daily Mail prize of £10,000, which is a hell of a lot more money nowadays, isn't it? They're also both knighted by George V. And there we go, folks. Not everything that happened in British history this week, but a few. And I hope you enjoyed just that little ramble through and a gallop through some events that some you may have known about, some you possibly never heard about at all. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'll just quickly say We've got a fair few there. Watch Sarah Jane's watched the Battle of Naseby reenactment. Poll tax triggers the Peasants' Revolt, June the 15th, 1381. One of the ones I was going to talk about today, just didn't have time. So thank you very much for announcing that one. And someone else has said Harvey Tadman's mentioned the poll tax as well, or the Peasants' Revolt. Yeah, said that. Charlie Manson says 72 hours on a plane coming across the Atlantic, probably a bit chilly. Yes, I bet it blinking well was. I could imagine they could hardly walk when they got off at Galway. Thank you everyone for joining. If you haven't watched it, pop over and watch the Fashoda incident, my latest video. And coming soon, I have what have I got coming up for you in the near future? Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. It's a film that's come out already in the US, I think on Netflix. Hasn't come out yet in Britain, as far as I'm aware, but it's on its way. That's all about SOE operations in West Africa during the Second World War. And I thought I would actually go and tell you the real story of what happened with the real Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Don't know if that would appeal to people. Got that one coming up. Got another visit to South Africa. Can never get enough of the Zulu Wars, can you? And I've been running a poll at the moment in my community post, just asking, a couple of battles, which ones. In fact, I've got all sorts of battles coming up here. And we were having, I think the poll was Plessy, Dettingen, the Battle of the Boyne, Bannockburn, and Sluys. And I think Plessy and the Boyne are at the minute running at the top of that pile. So there's a very good chance I'll be doing stories about those two in the not too distant future, because I'm going to actually start to tell stories almost about battles and things as sort of when they related in the diary, as it were. So anyway, hopefully that sounds good. So everyone, have a lovely weekend. I'm down to London to see my daughter tomorrow, so looking forward to that. I don't know where we're going, possibly the Cabinet War Rooms, which would be good. I've never been there before, so I thought, she said to me, is there anything in history you'd really like to do in London? And so I mentioned that. And then she said, there's a food festival in Regent's Park. So I think we might be going there instead, but who knows? It'd be just lovely to spend time with Zoe. So that'd be smashing. So whatever you're doing this weekend, have an absolutely brilliant one. Enjoy yourselves. And if you want to sign up for my weekly newsletter, which tells you when videos are coming out and podcasts are coming out, etc., and gives you access to things like my history quizzes, like I did last night, then just pop over to the website at thehistorychap.com. It's in the details below. Sign up free of charge. But in the meantime, keep well. I'll see you next week with another video. And thank you so much for all your support as ever. Thank you very much indeed.